Whether you call it kveik, kvik, or kvike, there's no denying that this unique Norwegian yeast has had a remarkable impact on the brewing scene, and Imperial Yeast's A43 Loki is one of the best versions out there. With the ability to produce a clean beer when fermented as warm as 104 degrees Fahrenheit or 40 degrees Celsius, you heard that right, while also performing well at more standard ale temperatures, Imperial Yeast A43 Loki is as versatile as it gets, meaning you have zero excuses for failing to brew throughout the year. Learn more about A43 Loki at imperialyeast.com and grab a pouch for your next batch to see what all the fuss is about. Dark, coffee, chocolate, malty. These are the descriptors I'd imagine most people associate with stout, whether of the dry Irish or hefty American sort. This isn't a style known for possessing, well, pretty much any other characteristics, particularly fruitiness. That is until recently. Now, you're listening to the Brewlosophy podcast. I'm your host, Marshall Schott, and joining me on this episode to talk about the arguably unique style known as Tropical Stout is contributor Andy Carter.
Hey, Marshall, I brewed a tropical stout. It's got to have been 8 years ago. And I read the style guidelines and I was kind of piecing together what was going on here. I don't even know if it was called tropical stout back then. But, the funny thing is, I think homebrewers love to dig into history, get a little taste of what something used to be. I mean, look, IPA is an incredibly popular beer these days, and it's been changed over time. So it's really cool to read about what you did for Short and Shoddy in the tropical stout.
Yeah, I love stout. From classic Guinness to rich imperial versions, I've always been a fan of the way the strong roasted flavors meld with other characteristics to create what I feel is a very pleasurable drinking experience. Up until, maybe 6 or 7 years ago, Andy, I would never have imagined fruitiness playing a role in this inky style. But that's exactly the case for Tropical Stout, which we're going to be getting into depth into today, as well as contributor Paul Amico's attempt to brew one using Short and Shoddy methods. All right, if you're a fan of what we're up to and you want us to keep doing it, consider becoming a patron of Brewlosophy. By committing to a small monthly pledge over at patreon.com/Brewlosophy, you'll receive rewards like access to unpublished recipes, unique discounts at YakimaValleyHops.com, and an invite to a monthly live Q&A session with somebody in the brewing world. We have got some really cool rewards coming up for February. $5 off 1-pounder bags of hops. I'm not going to tell you which one it is yet, from Yakima Valley Hops, as well as our guest for February of 2022, research and development scientist from Yakima's John I. Haas, Julia Jennings, whose job includes doing a mix of fundamental research on hops and assisting in the development of awesome new hop products. Julia has been deemed the Hop Witch of Haas, which is a moniker that she wears with pride. Whether you're a hophead or just someone interested in what goes on behind the scenes of one of the world's largest hop companies, this session is going to be a killer one. Julia will be hanging out with patrons on February 26th, 2022, so make sure to make your pledge of just $3 or more by Friday the 25th, which will also give you access to all past sessions with guests like John Palmer, Michael Tonsmeyer, Dr. Tom Shellhammer, and many, many more. To check out all of the other rewards you can get for helping us do what we do, head over to patreon.com/Brewlosophy. Feedback is brought to you by Brewers Hardware, who have an array of amazing purpose-built stainless brewing products to improve your brew day. If you're looking for a high-quality pilot brewery, make sure to check out the gorgeous BH15 single-tier system, which comes with a hard plumb manifold to eliminate all hosing changes during the brew process. Head over to brewershardware.com to see what they're all about, and make sure to mention Brewlosophy at checkout to receive a free gift. That's brewershardware.com. Our friend Brian from the suigeneriebrewing.com blog wrote in with a bit of clarification after listening to the episode where we talked about different brewery sanitizers. Brian said Starsan is an anionic acid sanitizer, and while their formula is proprietary, the general concept is pretty common, and there are a lot of products that work in the same way. The dodecyl benzosulfonic acid, I don't think I'm saying that properly, is an anionic detergent, a molecule with a fat-loving end and a water-loving end that is positively charged. That positive charge is attracted to the surface of microbes that are almost always negatively charged. One attracted to the bacterial or yeast membrane, the fat-loving part, or once attracted to the bacterial or yeast membrane, the fat-loving part of the detergent inserts itself into the membrane. This isn't enough to kill the microbe, but it does make their membrane leaky enough that the phosphoric acid can get inside. This acidifies the inside of the microbe, which pretty much instantly stops all metabolic activity, killing the microbe. The residue that's left when used as a no-rinse agent is too dilute to harm yeast. The yeast can break down the detergent part the same way they break down lipids, while the phosphate in the phosphoric acid can be used to help make DNA, RNA, and other biological molecules. Iodophor works quite differently. Iodine is highly reactive and basically oxidizes everything that cells are made of. Lipids, proteins, and DNA all get nuked. It's the chemical equivalent of lighting the cell on fire.
Yeah, I wish that was in homebrew talk when I was reading about sanitizers back in the day. This makes perfect sense. I mean, I've read similar things. I've also read a little bit about Star San, and people have done few tests. He kind of alluded to maybe it's a little gentler on some yeast or some bacteria and stuff. So, I mean, personal experience, I've tried, I think, every sanitizer, no rinse under the sun.
Yeah.
And for me, I've rarely have an issue with Star San if everything is clean ahead of time, right? It's not a cleaner, it's a sanitizer. I have done iodophor a couple times, and some people like to rotate through different ones just to make the cleaning process or the sanitizing process just to keep the microbes on their toes.
Yeah.
But today I really only use Star San. Maybe I'll bump up the concentration a little bit just to feel better at night, but I love Star San, and how it works, it makes perfect sense, right? And the thing is, for me, no rinse is a big deal.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. And I had no idea how these two sanitizers actually work until Cade and I talked about it on that episode. And Brian really did clarify a lot of that. I think it's fascinating. I like I said, I tend to stick with Star San primarily because I can make a batch of it and let it sit in my garage for a couple of months. And all I have to do is pop a pH meter down in there and make sure it's below 3.0 pH, and we're good to go. And it lasts way longer than iodophor. So that's why I stick with that.
What I like about Star San, and I use this at home, is I have a glass carboy. Since I've basically eradicated glass carboys from my brewing process, it's just stores Star San. And RO water and Star San, that thing is clear for months.
Yeah.
And it'll get cloudy sometimes. What I've noticed with using stainless steel fermenters is if you do rinse stainless steel and it's maybe a little bit not passivated, it'll start to cloud up Star San. So I just watch that. But otherwise, you can get a lot of mileage out of 5 gallons of Star San.
Yeah, and again, I love the stuff for that reason primarily. But I do go back and forth every once in a while, particularly with kegs. I have iodophor in my closet as well, and so I use that in between. So, well, thank you so much for the clarification, Brian. We always appreciate hearing from you, and look forward to collaborating at some point in the future. If you have show feedback, you can send it to feedback@brewlosophy.com or leave us a note on social media. So, back in episode 203, where we bid farewell to our dear friend Jersey, the guys and I reviewed a grip of beers submitted by listeners, one of which was a Belgian pale ale made with a particular type of pepper from someone named Mac. Being from the Chicago area, Mac's inspiration for this beer was the tasty foods associated with his hometown that are often topped with gardenia, hence the name, Hot Flemish Gardenia. Well, I had an extra bottle, so I figured I'd surprise the guys with it again.
1 minute beer review with Justin and Tim.
This is a purty one.
It's a
red
reddish
caramel. Oh, I tell you what, whoever made this, from a looks perspective, they developed a supermodel.
I don't get any smell.
From a taste perspective,
That's not a good face.
no. This is a what do they call it? A Picasso or a Van Gogh? Good from far, far from good. This has a lot of burnt caramely flavor overtones.
Oh, I just got a little smell.
It has like a thick type of a taste to it.
Oh, God.
Yeah, it's the viscosity is not that of water.
It's got like jalapeno in it.
It's spicy. There is a real spicy characteristic that I'm getting in the back of my throat.
Oh, dear God.
I want to like this because it's pretty, but I cannot
do not
like
wanna
this.
like this.
Phew.
I think it's got like a jalapeno habanero.
There's a pepper of some sort that was brewed in this.
Yeah. It's not me.
The color is incredible, but the flavor just doesn't match the color.
It's a good looking.
It's kind of like a Ferrari with a 4-cylinder in it.
Yeah. It's not me. Ugh.
How many Timmy J's you got?
I'm not even gonna give it one. I don't like it.
Yeah, okay. Well, I guess it's 0 to 1, and 1's got to be 1.
It's not good.
I can't really recall what the guys thought of this beer during the farewell episode when they first tasted it, but I don't think they hated it as much as they seem to in this review. I actually think that there's something really special about the way the Gardenia works with this Belgian pale ale. It makes it kind of have this umami character that I'd be lying if I said didn't make me pine for a hot dog or something. It was quite tasty, actually.
I can see where they're coming from in terms of not liking it. I think these are very polarizing beers, especially pepper beers.
Yeah.
That if you're just not used to, or you're not expecting spice, I know breweries around here, they've experimented with it. Usually 1 or 2 beers a year will have some level of heat. Really, it's a beer usually made for the person making it and not for anyone else. So I can see where if you're not expecting it, not desiring it, it's going to be off. But I mean, I love the concept. I love the conceptualization of this beer. I don't know about execution and how to do it better, but I love the concept.
Yeah, well, I mean, usually, at least in my experience, pepper beers are either really dark. So I had Inda Canindra from Ballast Point years ago, which has all of these like Indian spices with a little bit of heat. There's that, but most of them to me are like pale lagers with jalapeno or habanero in it.
Yes.
So the fact that Mac blended this gardenia, which I don't think I've ever had that pepper in the way that he's saying they use it as a condiment, but I would love to try it. The fact that he blended it with this Belgian pale ale that had a nice, toasty malt character with that Belgian yeast character, it really did work. I mean, the guy has there's those people who can conceptualize flavors. I have a feeling Mac is one of these people because I thought this beer was quite tasty, but I also knew that it had peppers in it. And I feel like if you don't know, which the guys didn't, obviously they guessed. I mean, it's pretty easy when your mouth starts to get warm, but when you don't know, it can be kind of surprising and catch you off guard. So thank you so much again, Mac, for sending in those beers. If you'd like to have your beer or any other fermented beverage reviewed by Justin and Tim on the show, you can email me, Marshall@brewlosophy.com, and we will get you all set up. When we return from this break, the focus will be on Tropical Stout. Chilling work can be a chore, especially after a long brew day, but not with the Exchillerator Counterflow Chiller, which can chill a 5-gallon or 19-liter batch of wort in 5 minutes or less, leading to a strong cold break and clear wort in the fermenter. Brewlosophy's Matt Del Fiacco uses the Exchillerator Max and absolutely loves it. In addition to improved chilling efficiency, every Exchillerator comes with a 5-year warranty that covers the entire chiller for manufacturer defects. If you're looking to up your chilling game and a CFC is right for you, head over to Exchillerator.com today. There's no denying that stainless steel is the best material for brewing equipment, and Delta Brewing Systems offers some of the lowest prices on high-quality stainless gear, like the Firm Tank, which in addition to holding 8 gallons or 30 liters of wort, comes with a domed lid to even further reduce the chances of a messy blow-off. Plus, it can hold up to 4 psi of pressure for closed transfers. Delta Brewing Systems also has their own line of brew kettles, as well as one of the lowest-priced all-in-one electric brewing systems out there, and their prices are shockingly low. If you're in the market for legit stainless gear that won't break the bank, do yourself a favor and head over to deltabrewingsystems.com today. Craftmaster Growlers takes traveling with and sharing beer to a new level. Made from heavy-duty stainless steel, Craftmaster Growlers are double-wall insulated and can keep beer cold for up to 8 hours. Unlike typical growlers, Craftmaster Growlers come with a swiveling tap and fully integrated CO2 regulator cap, allowing beer to stay fresh for 2 weeks or more. The square design takes up less space and will fit in most refrigerator doors, and every Craftmaster Growler comes with a 1-year warranty. There are 64 and 128-ounce versions available over at craftmastergrowlers.com. After a long brew day, the last thing I want to do is waste more time chilling wort. I've tried so many different options, and ultimately I settled on the super efficient immersion chillers made by Jaded Brewing. With the King Cobra and Hydra, I'm able to chill my entire batch of wort from boiling to just a few degrees above groundwater temperature in as little as 6 minutes. If an immersion chiller is right for your brewery, then do yourself a favor and check out all of the rad options Jaded Brewing has to offer at jadedbrewing.com, and be sure to let them know Brewlosophy sent you. Up until recently, my general conception of stout was that it's a malty ale with strong roast characteristics. While I understood there were various versions of stout made in their own unique ways based on the region where they were developed, I never imagined describing one as fruity, but that's exactly what's expected for Tropical Stout. Now, I've done quite a bit of sleuthing on this style and found remarkably little online, hence we'll be relying pretty heavily on what the BJCP has to say about Tropical Stout as they removed it as a sub-style of Foreign Extra Stout and officially made it its very own style in the 2015 guidelines.
Yeah. So I think a lot of things that we know from the United States, we've imported from either English brewing or German brewing. And so we have a kind of a hodgepodge here, but there's a lot of rich history going back into England. And one of these beers being really the origin case was Foreign Extra Stout, a beer that they made. It was around in the 19th century. England was exporting tons of this stout across the planet. This was preceded by porter. So, porter stout, and then as alcohols increase, bitterness increases, you get this thing called stout.
Yeah.
And as it was getting around, some of this beer got to the West Indies, and particularly in the Caribbean, this beer landed. Once it got there, a kind of interesting thing happened. Not only were they, obviously consuming a lot of the export or the import from England, they started to play with it and started brewing their own styles, right? So if we say the best beer is always made locally, well, they decided to make some of their own versions of it, and they started to play with the ingredients a little bit.
Yeah, that's the part that interests me so much. And it makes sense, right? Is that you've got this style of beer that gets really popular over in England. And we're talking, middle 19th century, maybe end of the 19th century. They're shipping crazy amounts of foreign export stout, which, as an aside, I feel like to understand tropical stout, we kind of have to understand a little bit of the history of foreign export stout, which is basically a stronger version of the stout the locals in England were drinking, right? But they made it a bit stronger for shipping. If that's my understanding, at least.
Yeah, I mean, that's kind of, there's some going a little bit back and forth, romanticism and things like that. I think there's two things. One is, of course, you find out over time, you learn about what makes something stay, what's shelf stable, right? Alcohol, IBUs.
Yeah.
But there's also what they want when they get it, right? So having heavily hopped beers when they get back there become maybe not as hoppy or not as aromatic, then other styles develop around that. And so there's a little bit of a consumer demand, and then there's also process, right? Those go hand in hand. So it's not one or the other.
Yeah. So this beer, this foreign export stout, I doubt they were calling it foreign export stout back then, but it was the stuff that they were making for shipping to other countries, lands in the Caribbean, lands in the West Indies, and then obviously the locals there are saying, well, how can we put our own spin on this?
Exactly.
And I believe, historically speaking, the primary thing that they would do is use local ingredients on the fermentation side, not necessarily that they were growing their own hops and tossing in these tropical hops. In fact, as you'll hear later on, that is not expected in a tropical stout. It really is supposed to be, my understanding at least, a fruitiness that comes from the fermentation of, say, local sugars. You've got sugar cane growing, crazy in the Caribbean, and stuff like that. So it really is kind of this regionalization of a product, of a style that was originally developed somewhere else, and then kind of the locals kind of put their own spin on it. And I love that, and that is really kind of the story of a lot of styles that exist these days.
Well, I mean, look at what we've done with English IPA, American IPA, hazy IPA, milkshake IPA. I mean, we're watching the evolution of IPA as it unfolds in our own lives, right? It goes around different parts of the state, different parts of the country, different parts of the world. Right now, for a long time, and I know you remember this, Marshall, for a long time, American beer was seen as terrible. Right now, American beer is seen as the marker, the high water mark for a great beer. Right now, that's going to other places. Right, over the last, say, 2 decades, we've exported beer styles all over the planet. Right, and now they're taking their spin. So this is just history rhyming it with itself again.
I like the way you put that. So in terms of tropical stout, now we're going to go through and talk about the basic descriptors that are used for this style. But I want to give a little bit of credit to the BJCP for actually including it as its own style back in 2015. I as someone who doesn't really appreciate reductionism too much, I can be a bit critical of the BJCP, but they do a lot of good stuff for helping us to organize our thoughts around specific styles. And the fact that they've included, I mean, I'll be honest, I hadn't even heard of tropical stout until, and I'm a certified BJCP judge. I hadn't even heard of it until 2015 when they added it to the style guidelines. So
let's go over the style, I think. So start with the appearance. We want a deep brown to inky black color. I mean, there's a little bit of range here. I think we see a lot of dark beers. You're seeing a whole variety. But it's got to be dark. That's where the roast malt or whatever roasted malts you're going to use. Should be clear. It's not opaque, right? So difference between like a haze or a high opacity, it should be if you can see through it because it's not dark enough, it's clear.
Yeah.
And then fluffy tan, brown foam, good retention. So something you'd expect because of the dark grains that are in the beer. So I mean, these are just for appearance-wise, it's just going to look like a stout. That's what it should be.
Yeah, it's not going to have pineapple hanging out off of the lip of the glass or an umbrella. I guess you could do that, but
you could do that.
In terms of the clarity, I think for me it's really important. One of the grossest looking beers, is a hazy stout or a hazy brown ale.
Yeah,
because when you mix that brownish color with yeast haze, it just looks like mud. And so to me, this is a style like all stouts out there that really you can't get away with the excuse of it's dark, so who cares? If I hold hold that up and I tilt that glass, that pint, and I hold it up to the sun and I can see a ruby glimmer through the edge, that's what I'm looking for. I want it clear. I want the yeast out of the way. So
exactly.
Yeah. So in terms of aroma, we're looking for moderate to high sweetness on the nose, a roast including coffee and chocolate, which is fully expected, medium to high fruitiness. We'll talk about how that gets there in a bit. And then also, on the nose to get a bit of molasses or kind of a licorice dried fruit character. That is all perfectly acceptable. And those are characteristics largely associated with two things. One, dark malts can contribute, or dark grains in general can contribute that kind of deep, dark fruit characteristic, but so can certain yeast at fermentation temperatures that are a bit warmer than they should be, I suppose.
I mean, there's a lot here. I think we'll talk more about this during the actual process for the beer, but there's a lot of things here where it's like, is it adjuncts? Is it grains? Is it yeast? And now hold on, this is really not just a stout anymore. I'm thinking this is like Belgian stout or something like that too, right?
Yeah.
Where you're getting all these other ways to play it. So even though it seems restrictive or it seems foreign to someone that's not used to brewing the style, like there's a lot of running room here, especially in the aroma, which I like.
Yeah, I agree. No diacetyl, or they say when it comes to like beers that originated in England, you can have low amounts of diacetyl. You're not intending to get that buttery diacetyl in there though. So do what you can to keep it out. And then this part is interesting to me because, Tropical Stout is known for having this fruity character to it. And yet the BJCP says in terms of aroma, there should be low to no hop character on the nose. We will talk a little bit more about that later, but I think that's interesting. So, you're thinking about when I smell this beer, I'm picking up, I hate to call it tropical notes, but that is what it is. Yeah. Kind of this fruitiness as compared to other types of stout. But the BJCP says that fruitiness apparently is not coming from the hop. So keep that in mind. I think it's interesting.
Yeah. Yeah. So then for flavor, you want it be sweet and balanced between some coffee, some chocolate, and not bitter, not too bitter. If we look at the history, right, you have a beer that was exported. So it had a very high IBU, high bitterness level to then kind of fade as it got to the place. Right. So if you look at if you could imagine a recipe for foreign extra stout, the IBUs would be through the roof because it's not meant to be drank immediately versus making this fresh. You're going to have an IBU or a target bitterness that's more in line with having it fresh, not aged.
Yeah. Yeah.
And then, you want, maybe a dark rum flavor would be nice here. I think we're playing up the fruitiness, we're playing up the tropical aspects of the beer. And like you said, no or very little hop flavor, which I think is playing interesting into the recipe that was designed for this.
Yeah. One of the descriptors that I saw somebody write online when they were making Tropical Stout that I thought made a lot of sense, because you're considering, a noticeable sweetness. You've got this kind of dark rum-like quality that may come from adjuncts being used. You've got this bit of fruitiness that's not supposed to be overwhelming. Somebody said something like a cola quality, which I thought, that kind of makes sense. I've had stouts, not tropical stouts, but I've had stouts before in the past that definitely have kind of a subtle cola quality that's rather pleasant, So I think that would probably be an appropriate descriptor for this style as well. In terms of mouthfeel, you're looking for medium to full body, smooth, creamy, sounds like a stout, right? Slight warming from stronger versions is acceptable, though you don't want it to be overwhelmingly boozy. And then, this is intended to be a refreshing beer to drink, even though it's a dark, stout. It's intended to be kind of a refreshing beer to drink in the Caribbean climate, that warm, tropical climate. And so again, your focus is on making this thing crushable and refreshing, and not just this thick, hard to drink, syrupy stout. Let's talk over some of the vital stats of this style.
Yeah, so we're going to start from anywhere from 1056 to 1075 OG. So, I mean, you do build this to have alcohol, right? This is not a dry Irish stout or something like that, right? Though you're also expecting not to finish too low because you have you may have some unfermentable adjuncts or something like that, and maybe a yeast that is not as attenuative or as well. So you need to start a little high to then have a higher finishing gravity, and the finishing gravities are a little higher, 1010 to 1018 finishing gravity. Yeah. This puts you in the range of 5.5% up all the way up to 8%. So there's quite a bit of latitude here on the alcohol, which is nice depending on what kind of version of this you're going for. 30 to 50 IBUs. Again, it's it's got to match the bitterness has to kind of match the sweetness, so it's not out of balance.
Yeah.
Though I would say personally, I would probably err on the side of less IBUs just for the style, but do what you want to do. And then 30 to 40 SRM. So I mean, this has got to be dark, right? We're clearly making a stout, so don't shirk the roasted malt in this case.
Yeah, and to me, on the comment about the IBU and the sweetness, I'm with you. Tropical Stout is supposed to, again, refreshing, sweet, tropical. You're trying to uphold whatever fruity characteristics might be in this beer, and to me, that is done well with having a slight edge towards the sweetness. So when you're designing a Tropical Stout, keep that in mind. The other thing about IBU, what we've been finding over the last few years at least, is that one person's 35 or 40 IBU may not necessarily be perceptibly as bitter as another person's 35 or 40 IBU, and so being able to kind of adjust that based on what you know about your system is important as well. So
what I like about or trying that for yourself at home, and I've been playing with this recently, is we have many different calculators for IBU. I would run your IBUs through all of them and then say to yourself, is this a 30 or is this a 50?
Yeah.
Because the calculators will change quite a bit, and then pick the calculator for what you perceive. I tend to perceive my bitterness less than others, so I actually need to be adding more hops to get the same quote unquote level of bitterness that other people receive. So I would just play with the calculators too.
Yeah, and I'm in the same boat. I tend to get a little bit less bitter. So for a Tropical Stout, I'm going to be adding a bit more up front, a bit more bittering hops up front in the kettle, as opposed to somebody down the street from me who might get more bitterness out of their hop addition.
Exactly.
So, and again, it's about balance. But for me, with Tropical Stout, we're going to kind of edge towards that sweet thing. And one way to do that is through the malts that you're using in this type of beer. Obviously, you're going to go with a heavy dose of pale malt. You're going to have some dark roasted grains. I think it's fair to say that if you want to shy a little bit away from the heavier coffee chocolate roastiness, that you can go with something like a huskless midnight wheat or a Carafa special type of grain for this. Though I think it's probably pretty common to see your standard 500 Lovabond really dark roasted barley.
Yeah, I mean, and looking at we go back to aroma and flavor. I mean, those higher Lovabonds, at least for me, are where you get that licorice, that like rum, all that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
I mean, it's going to be there. I personally think you're going to need that yeast to kind of bump it up a little bit. I think this is more of a yeast-centric beer than necessarily a malt-centric beer. That's just how I interpret it. But I think you do want those heavier ones. But if you're trying to make something just dark, then, go with the dehusked or huskless, and I think you'll also make a fantastic beer.
Yeah, and then the other key, I would say, again, we're talking leaning into that sweetness, is caramel malt. Now, you think about those darker roasted caramel malts, those C120s or the C90s, those tend to contribute what people describe as being kind of a raisin or pruny characteristic, which when combined with all of these other characteristics in this stout so far, you're going to perceive as being kind of this sweet, rummy, jammy sort of thing. And that is exactly what you're looking for. So this is one of those styles that I would contend really does need to have at least some amount of dark caramel malt in it.
Absolutely. One of my favorite malts of all time is Special B, right? And that's typically thought of as a Belgian style one, but I think you could use it across all these styles, especially in dark beers, stouts, and porters, just to amp up that those high notes of fruit. Basically.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. That Special B is one of those malts that has a very particular characteristic to it that I find is pretty easy to point out. And you read about the description of Tropical Stout, Special B would fit in this beer perfectly, in my opinion. So now, again, you don't want to overdo it because you're trying to create this balance between that sweetness with those flavor characteristics and such. Now, another way, and this is very common for Tropical Stout. In fact, it's one of the historical explanations as to how this beer tended to take on a little bit more fruity characteristics, are adjuncts, using local sugars. We know that most sugars, particularly the simpler they are, if you're using sugar cane or whatever it might be, that those sugars, when fermented, are going to produce esters that tend to be perceived as somewhat more fruity. So if you're adding a good dose of a fresh sugar cane, or I don't know what other types of sugar products are made from sugar cane other than molasses and granulated sugar, but you add those, and then in your head, you're going, well, these are going to be fermented by the yeast as well. And that is supposed to be in part where some of that fruitiness comes from. Yeah.
So if you think of how we tend to brew beer almost with all of barley, and yeast has been kind of essentially bred or grown to ferment barley liquids, right? When you add sugar, you can make the yeast kind of go through other metabolic paths that really want to consume glucose or simpler sugars and not go to the maltose. And so it can get stressed out. It can start throwing flavors you're not expecting, but that's kind of what you want for this style. It's not just the ingredient. Like if you just add a clean sugar, I don't know how much flavor you're going to get from it, but really it's the modification of how the yeast is fermenting and throwing new flavors at you versus the ingredient itself. But like you said, I would contend that if you in the modern brewing, molasses or maple syrup or any things that have other flavors would provide you that kind of a similar thing. But I think the yeast plays a huge role in that too.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, before we get to yeast, the hops, you're just looking for bitterness primarily. I mean, this is basically a foreign extra stout when it comes to the hops, which is that, I think it's easy for people to misconstrue that a little bit because of the fruity component of tropical stout. But really, you're looking for traditionally brewed, you're looking for hops primarily for bitterness, front of the kettle, and that is it. And then the yeast. And I think this is a very interesting component. Traditionally, tropical stout was fermented, it's made with these adjunct sugars, and then it's fermented with a lager yeast at warmer temperatures. At least that's what the BJCP says. This is purportedly where that fruitiness comes from. You got these adjunct sugars that are in there with this lager yeast, which is widely believed to produce noticeable esters when fermented at ale temperatures. And that is the way this beer was traditionally supposed to be brewed.
Yeah, and I'm guessing this is coming from we're making lagers, or we're in the process of making lagers during the time they were making these beers, and this is maybe the yeast they had around. Now, I could be totally wrong about that, but I'm guesstimating that that's why a lager yeast, a good pitch of lager yeast was available. Like, hey, we'll make this beer that we're already making. But I'd be curious. We should definitely look into that a little more, because it'd be interesting to know why lager yeast came about for this one. But then it just was used, and everyone liked it and kept drinking it, so that made sense. For me, I don't know if I'm kind of torn here. I would have to know my lager yeast very well to commit to this process and make sure it's not throwing like a really crazy ester that's very one dimensional. Because to me, when warm ferments go wrong, they become very singular and not really pleasant. So I'll be a little bit dicey, but that's me. Yeah,
I've done so many warm fermentations with lager strains that don't end up being at all estery. And so it's tough for me to wrap my head around that being the culprit for the fruitiness that Tropical Stout's known for, which you will see in the recipe that I designed later. So traditional brewing, this is basically how you would brew a foreign extra stout. You're looking at standard English brewing practices, nothing terribly complicated. For water chemistry, I would contend probably higher chloride levels just to balance that, balance it towards the malty and the sweet, as opposed to that sharper, sulfate thing that you get when you're using more higher amounts of gypsum. You're going to mash for 60 minutes, single infusion. 150F to 154F is probably pretty standard. That 66 to 68C. This isn't set in stone. If you want something a little bit more sweeter, or I guess thicker, lower alcohol, I would contend, you mash a little bit warmer. You can mash a little bit cooler. I think you can get away with a lot here. You're going to boil it for about 60 minutes, make your standard hop additions. Again, you're looking for a tropical stout, you're looking primarily for bitterness from your kettle hopping. So this is not traditionally a late hopped type of beer. Chill it, ferment it. What would you ferment yours around? I mean, you're gonna pitch some lager yeast into this traditional tropical stout and then ferment it right around room temp, right?
Yeah, I mean, if that's where you want to go. I mean, again, I feel so gun shy about running these lager yeast, but we know from personal experience, Harvest from Imperial Yeast, just a great all around 50 to 70 degree Fahrenheit player. So I mean, I'd feel no qualms about that, and maybe you're driving new flavors too. But honestly, I think safer for me would be use an ale yeast that you like, and it's middle of the road. But go for any of these. I think they would all work. I think you're just going to find what works well with the grain bill you're using too, right? So those go kind of hand in hand.
Well, and that's one of the comments I had when it comes to using a lager yeast. Primarily when I'm using lager yeast at fermenting them at ale temps, I'm making pale lager. And so perhaps there is some interaction that occurs that I'm unaware of when using a lager yeast to ferment these darker beers that does create the impression of a fruitiness more. I don't know. It's definitely worth trying, I feel
Absolutely.
like. But it is perfectly appropriate to use an ale strain as well if that's what you'd prefer to do. So now this beer should be clear. You don't want it to be muddy and gross. So make sure to take care of whatever you need to make sure that that beer drops clear and that you're ridding it of any remnant yeast that you can see with your eye at least. In terms of packaging, carbonation, and serving, you're looking for a moderate to moderate high carbonation. Again, refreshment is the key here. And then serve it with a nice fluffy head as well. That carbonation is going to bump up that foam as well.
And then, what are you thinking on, what's a good example of this style? I mean, it's hard for me to comment because there's so few of these made. I think the only times I've had these are at homebrew competitions. Yes. The rare example being a rare exception being like maybe you're at a restaurant that has a menu that one of them says tropical stout. That's where I'm thinking. But I think from the descriptions we have, what we can piece together and ones I've had at homebrew competitions, it's got to be smooth roast. You don't want anything big like an Russian imperial stout or something like that. No harshness.
Yep.
You definitely want that sweetness. And as the BJCP style guidelines says, it's somewhere like a sweet stout, maybe even a little sweeter. And that's because you have that yeast or malt component that's playing up the other complexities of the perception of sweetness, right? It's not just sweet to be sweet, but it's sweet because it has rum, raisin, plum, dark fruits, that kind of thing. And it starts at 5.5, but it goes to 8, right? So that's actually quite a range of alcohol for a style. I think that just because of BJCP is not not usually something where home brewers do it and then pro brewers do it. Usually this comes from pro brewers, and you look at the spectrum of beers that are available, and I would guess that there is commercially called beers called tropical stout that start at 5.5 and go to 8. So there's a range here too, but you do want it to be somewhat hefty, but you don't want that alcohol. In most styles, you're not looking for any type of alcohol heat whatsoever.
Yeah, exactly. You want it to have some strength to it, to have some bones, but without it being distracting is how I look at it, right? You don't want that alcohol warmth to kind of annoy you as it's going down. And then finally, you're supposed to have some fruitiness. You're somehow get a little bit of that fruity thing going to make it the tropical stout that it is supposed to be. Now, some notable commercial examples. I've never had one of these. Lion Stout, which is out of Sri Lanka, Dragon Stout, which is out of Jamaica, and ABC Extra Stout. That's the only one I'd actually heard of prior to this episode, which is out of Singapore. Again, like you, the only tropical stouts that I'm aware of that I have had have been homebrewed, and there have been very few of those that I've tried. Yeah.
Unfortunately, unless you go to these places, I don't think you're going to have a good example, because now we have the tropical stout, foreign extra stout reversed, right? Now they're exporting their their tropical stout to another country where it was not supposed to be. And this happens all the time with beers that get imported, exported. It's never going to be what it was over there. So, I think I've seen Lion Stout on a menu at a restaurant. That's about it, right? So, the next time I'm in Sri Lanka, I will go and try to have those beers fresh, but it's going to be tough. And that's honestly, that's kind of why homebrewing's so cool, right? If you can come up with these descriptions and piece together a recipe that kind of represents this, that's cool. I think the only one concrete example I can give of this is Belgian single, and going to Belgium, having an actual fresh Belgian single, and then imprinting that in my own mind to then make here. Yeah. Right? That's the only way you would know that, because that beer is so delicate.
Exactly. Well, having never had this style of beer and genuinely not really knowing what to expect from it at all, except for what I've read in the BJCP, it made designing a recipe all the more challenging, right? I wanted the recipe that I designed for this to have I wanted the beer to have a fruitiness, a noticeable fruitiness, and I know my brewing system, and I know what happens when I ferment with a lager yeast warm, which may be a function of home brewing, but what happened when we made one using short and shoddy methods? Results from that when we're back from this break. Family-owned Atlantic Brew Supply is the largest homebrew shop in the Southeast. No gimmicks, no multinational corporate overlords, and no BS. They offer exclusive malts, yeast, and more from local artisans, as well as award-winning recipe kits. They also sell professional brewing gear and cask equipment from sister companies ABS Commercial and Cask Supply. Most ingredients are available by the ounce, plus Atlantic Brew Supply has an on-site calculator to help you craft your best brew. Orders are processed same day, and 2-day shipping is guaranteed for East Coast customers. Get 15% off your first order using promo code BREWPOD. That's BRUPOD at AtlanticBrewSupply.com. As every brewer knows, the best beer requires the best hops, which Yakima Valley Hops provides fresh from the source to brewers around the world, carrying everything from classics like Cascade to modern favorites like Galaxy and Mosaic, as well as other ingredients and gear. Yakima Valley Hops has it all. And don't forget to check out their new podcast, The Late Edition, where the YVH crew goes into depth on our favorite plant with industry experts. Head over to YakimaValleyHops.com now to see all they have to offer and subscribe to The Late Edition wherever it is you listen to podcasts.
Compact and simple to use with a small footprint for brewing indoors, the Grainfather makes it easy for you to brew professional quality beers at home. The Grainfather is an all-in-one brewing system that lets you brew all-grain beer in a single, compact stainless steel unit. It uses an electric heating element and pump to maintain a constant temperature and to circulate the wort during the mashing and cooling stages. It also comes with a counterflow chiller to reduce chilling times and produce high-quality wort. And now, with the addition of their conical fermenter, the Grainfather takes things one step further by offering homebrewers state-of-the-art temperature-controlled fermentation just like commercial breweries use. And with the Grainfather Recipe Creator and Connect app, you can easily design a recipe, sync your brewing system with your phone, and then just sit back and relax as the app takes over and assures that you maintain your scheduled mash temps and boil schedule. Head to Grainfather.com to purchase your all-in-one brewing system today and to sign up for their free recipe creator tool. Once more, head on over to Grainfather.com, that's Grainfather.com, and get started today.
Typically, I design and brew the short and shoddy beers for Brewlosophy, but at one point last year, Paul expressed interest in whipping one up, so I shot him a tropical stout recipe that I'd been messing around with. We definitely took a little creative liberty on this one. It is short and shoddy after all, and it was based in part on the fact that neither of us had ever had a tropical stout, but also on some of our past experiment findings, right? And so that's basically what, when you look at it, the short and shoddy is based on, is what have we gotten away with so far in our experiments, and what can I get away with if I, compact all of those things together. And so that is the short and shoddy approach. So again, this was brewed by Paul Amico, though it's a recipe that was designed by me. He brewed on his 120 volt claw hammer electric system, which is going to mean it's not going to be as quick as when I brew on my 240 volt electric system, but he'd certainly cut some quarters. So his starting time was 8:15 p.m. In the evening. He collected the full volume of filtered water with no mineral adjustments made whatsoever. So, I think about the beers that I make, I always add some sort of mineralization. Usually for me, it's gypsum because I like my beers more crisp. In this case, I probably would have added a little bit more calcium chloride to really emphasize that malt roundness. But in this case, being short and shoddy, he just went with his water profile, which we happen to get water from the same source, is very, very soft. It's about, I think naturally we're at like 6 sulfate and like 8 chloride. So really, really just nothing in the water.
That's cool. I mean, that's nice to have such a blank slate to start with.
Yeah.
I also see no real issues here just starting with a blank slate and running with it. I mean, the one thing you always want to worry about is with dark beers is you want to raise the alkalinity of your mash because the acidity from the dark grains could impact it. So it doesn't look like you did anything. I mean, I'm not too worried either, depending on what you're making. This is short and shoddy after all, so you're just going to go for it. But that's one thing I would be concerned with, but
Yeah. People always ask me like, well, what have you changed anything because of your experience with short and shoddy? One of the things just based on experiments that I don't pay attention to at all anymore is the mash pH, only because what we've shown is that even when it does go too low or too high, people can't seem to tell a difference. Now, we have been able to demonstrate, some minor objective measurable differences in, say, OG and whatnot, but that didn't carry over in the flavor, at least in our testing so far. So we did not do any adjustments for this batch. The grain bill consisted of 62% Mecca grade La Manta pale malt, 21% Shaniko wheat malt from Mecca grade, 7% roasted barley, and 5% Metolius Munich malt, as well as 5% C120. Again, I'm going for that kind of raisiny, rummy characteristic. And to me, the richness that I get from that Metolius Munich malt from Mecca grade, combined with, just that nice raisiny kind of thing from the C120, I thought would work really well in this style.
I think it's cool that, the Munich malt almost operating like a like a crystal malt. You're saying you get so much flavor from it.
Yeah.
That at 5%, you're definitely going to taste it, which I think is pretty cool.
Yeah, I had originally messed around. Yeah, this was a recipe that I spent, I like to just toy around when I get bored. And I think I spent about 2 weeks messing around with it. And my idea originally was to do 50-50 in terms of the two primary base malts, was to do 50-50 Munich and pale malt. And I thought, I really want to kind of emphasize the fruitiness of this beer. And I think the Munich might get in the way of that. And so I came up with other ways to get that fruitiness in there. We'll talk about that. So when the water was to strike temperature, the grains were added and stirred to incorporate before checking to ensure it was at the target mash temperature of 150 degrees Fahrenheit, which is 66 C. The mash was left for just 30 minutes. Now, Paul likes to recirculate during his mash rest, so he did that to keep things more consistent within the mash. After which the grains were removed, the wort was then boiled for just 30 minutes. Now, this is where I did a few little short and shoddy tweaks that are probably, that don't jibe too well with the BJCP. I used 100% in this recipe Citra Lupomax hops. That is not traditional for a tropical stout, but my thinking was, having used Citra Lupomax a few times and getting this really nice, deep tropical fruit flavor from it, I thought that is going to be the way that I know, because I've used lager yeast many times. I've fermented with ale yeast. It is very difficult for me to get a noticeable fruity characteristic out of fermentation alone. And so I thought I'm gonna bump this up a little bit by using just Citra Lupomax. So I did 15 grams at 30 minutes, 20 grams of Citra Lupomax at 20 minutes, and 20 grams of Citra Lupomax at 2 minutes left in the boil. Now, 20 grams, that's that's about a half an ounce, a little over a half an ounce of hops. So this was not heavily hopped. My idea being, if I just throw just enough in there to goose up that fruitiness a little bit, then perhaps, I can get away with making this tropical stout that doesn't taste hoppy necessarily.
Yeah, I love this concept. When I read these style guidelines and I go to beer judging, when you have a style like this where it's maybe you don't know it because you don't have a commercial example to look at.
Yeah.
I've done this with other styles before. It's kind of like the movie Moneyball, where you're just trying to get on base. So it's like, okay, I just need to get fruitiness. How do I want to do that? There's many ways of doing that, right? You could have added fruit puree in the keg or something like that too, right? Just get fruit flavor. But I love the idea of using, a kind of engineered product like Lupomax to I know when I use it this way, it's going to happen, and just using it, and it's perfect. And I would also love to try to explain Lupomax to some brewer in the 1860s. This has been amazing.
I know. Just bring somebody from Haas back to.
Yeah.
So when the boil was complete, Paul chilled the wort with his accelerator chiller while it was transferring to his fermentation vessel. A refractometer reading showed that the wort was at 1053 OG, which is just perfect. Indicated that he was right at about 60% brewhouse efficiency. Again, for a 30-minute mash and a 30-minute boil, that's pretty great. The OG was a little bit lower than what the BJCP says, I believe, right? I believe the BJCP is 1054 or 1055 or 1056, I'm sorry, is the lowest range for the BJCP. So this fell just a tad below, three specific gravity points below that standard.
Yeah, I mean, I think we've seen experience in the past from other recipes that shouldn't matter too much. You may not have the alcohol you want in the end, but previous experience to this, you're within a few points, and there's always going to be wiggle room. So yeah, I think it all depends on if you're looking to, you don't want the finishing area to be too low. I think even though there's data that suggests there's not a statistical significance on that OG-FG alcohol, I did find with some dark beers, especially one experiment I did, that I think dark beers tend to respond a little bit more to the OG-FG kind of difference. So it's close enough.
Yeah, for fermentation, I would agree that the higher the OG, the more sugars are there for the yeast to do its thing with, and perhaps that would help to produce more fruity esters. But in this case, 1053 OG, 60% brewhouse efficiency. This is short and shoddy. We're not going to be married to those stats.
Exactly.
So at this point, the filled fermenter was moved to Paul's fermentation chamber, and a single pouch of Imperial Yeast Ale1 House was pitched into the 72 degree Fahrenheit or 24 C wort. Okay. Imperial Yeast, AO1 House. That is a classic English yeast. English yeasts are known for producing esters. Our decision to use this yeast, yet again, was based on our experience fermenting with the lager yeast that we had on hand. L17 Harvest, as well as, I believe, L13 Global, were the two that I had on hand at my house. House is known for producing these esters that I thought were appropriate in this style, and so that's why we opted for that strain.
I think it makes perfect sense, especially given that the the progenitor of this is like Foreign Extra Stout that would have used an English ale strain just like this, right?
Exactly.
So I think this makes perfect sense.
Yeah. So the time when Paul pitched that yeast was 11:56 p.m. for a total brew day time of just 3 hours and 41 minutes. Again, this is a 120 volt electric system that takes a little bit longer to heat water than the 240 volt. I'm usually right at the 2 hour mark, so it took him about an hour and 40 minutes longer. Plus, this was his very first time doing a short and shoddy, I believe, and so he was figuring things out as he went along. But this was about an hour and a half to 2 hours less than what his typical brew day length is when he's using that 120 volt system.
He had to get ready to cut corners. That's why it took longer. So that's
right. Prepping to cut corners in that one.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
So the beer was left to ferment in Paul's chamber at 68 degrees Fahrenheit or 20 degrees Celsius for 11 days before he took hydrometer measurements that showed it was at 1013 FG, which is spot on for this style, for a total ABV of 5.3%. Again, just a hair lower than what the BJCP recommends is the lowest end of that, the floor, if you will, 5.5%, but nothing that I'm too worried about.
Yeah, this is fine. And especially in the end, as we've talked about the style, it's all about this flavor and aroma and not so much the, whatever you're getting from the strength. Now, like you said, if there is a fermentation component, having a higher alcohol would maybe stress the yeast out more. But you've already, like we said, gotten the Citra Lupamax involved for fruitiness. You've got the high fermentation temperature for fruitiness. I think you're covering all your bases so far.
Yeah, I agree. And again, Paul's doing what I told him to do. So this is mostly my fault if he messes up. So he then transferred the beer to a sanitized keg. I do believe that he did a closed transfer because why not? Nobody wants oxidized beer. The beer was then burst carbonated at 45 PSI overnight before being reduced to serving pressure, where it was left for about a week before he was ready to serve it to tasters, and serve it to tasters he did. Now, some objective observations first. The appearance of this beer. It was beautiful. Dark black color with those ruby highlights on the edges. Crystal clear, at least what you could see through. Nice tan head. I mean, it matched the BJCP description fairly well.
Yeah, I mean, I would not expect it any different, right? Even though you took less, took less time, in the end, these short and shotties are based around real recipes that you could run at any length scale. So, I mean, I'm really interested to see what what you thought of the beer and what did you get in the flavor and the aroma though?
Yeah. So I'll never forget, Paul kegs this beer, he throws it on. We kind of forget that it's going on. We're pretty busy with all the brewing and writing and recording that we're doing. And he calls me about 2 weeks after kegging it, and he's like, dude, I got to bring you a growler of this beer. And oh, God, I forgot you had it. And he's like, I'm telling you, I cannot wait to hear what you think of it. So he brings me over this growler, and he and I alone in about 45 minutes blasted through an entire growler of Tropical Stout. It was, in my opinion, super refreshing. The Citra Lupamax was noticeable. That tropical note that I get from Citra was noticeable, but it did not take center stage, so that worked as planned. It was just enough to create this impression of fruitiness, which melded absolutely, surprisingly beautifully with the roasted malt character from this beer. One of the terms that I used that Paul used that I believe we included in the article was that it was confusingly crushable. It was just this weird juxtaposition of roasty and fruity and clean, but it was so good. And I again, probably one of the best stouts that I've had in a long time. And it was this interestingly weird brewed tropical stout.
What's interesting, or at least as we think through this, there's two things that come to mind. First is we had talked about how dark beers being refreshing in even hot climates. And to me, that's like the origins of cold brew coffee or iced coffee, right?
Oh, yeah.
You have this drink, you have this dark drink that's it's kind of hot out, but I still want the coffee. And you can really drink it fast and like a hot cup of coffee. The second thing that I love the use of Lupamax here because it's giving us another way of using hops that it's totally untraditional, right? You have this new product that you're like, oh yeah, just add it to a hazy IPA, you'll be fine. No. I want to edit beers because you can be so precise with what you're doing with it, the consistency of that product. And you can go and I want to add just a dash of it here. A local brewery, Endergren, uses Mosaic in their pale lager called Lagertha. And that Mosaic character paired with the malt is just so nice and so delicious. I might just have to go, we're going to stop taping this podcast. I'm just going to go up there and have one right now. But, to me, this use of hops almost starts the there's almost a through line to me to black IPA, right? When you have a dark beer with fruitiness, you can get both right now. But black IPA, of course, is really focused on the hops and not so much on the darkness. But there's a touch there that I really like. So
yeah, well, and black IPA is way more bitter. This was not bitter, right?
Yes,
the idea
exactly.
was to lean into that sweetness, and it's hard to explain because it's such a unique style. And so my short and shoddy take on it was to again rely on that Citra Lupamax for the hoppiness or for the fruitiness. I'm sorry, but without getting the hop character. Now I have this feeling after having used Lupamax so much that quote hoppiness is in part due to the vegetal matter that is in that when you hop, right? Naturally. Well, the fact that Lupamax contains significantly less of that, I think allows you to get away with just getting more of a pure fruity character from the from the lupulin and that's in those hops. So it worked out really well, at least to my palate. Now we did serve this to 22 tasters. The participants were informed of the style and asked to evaluate the beer based on both previous experiences with it, which I have to believe that these people didn't really have any experience with it like us. But we also did give them the BJCP description and had them kind of, evaluate this beer based on that description. For average characteristic rating, in terms of how hoppy, malty, and dry the beer was, tasters seemed to perceive the strongest characteristic, surprise, surprise, as being the beer's maltiness, which yielded an average rating of about 3.1 out of 5. Ratings on dryness and hoppiness were around 2.5 and 1.8 out of 5 respectively. So this to me lines up fairly well with, what we read about Tropical Stout in the BJCP guidelines.
Yeah. Perfect. I mean, that means you're hitting the marks here, and you didn't design this beer to be hoppy at all. So it's like, okay, good. I mean, they're perceiving it, which is good. Maybe they wouldn't peg it as Tropical Stout if you gave them the BJCP book and said, "Find me the style." But this makes sense.
Yeah, I agree. Now, in terms of, we had the evaluators, the tasters break down these different characteristics even more. So for hop character, 10 out of 22 of the people, now this to me is very interesting. 10 out of 22 described the most prominent hop characteristic as being earthy. 8 people said it was fruity. 3 identified pine and resinous as being the primary hop characteristic. 1 said dank caddy. Nobody endorsed spicy, floral, melon, berry, or onion garlic. Now, we added Citra Lupamax in relatively small amounts to this beer, and yet the hop character, when people blindly are going in and rating it, that most people said was earthy, which I think is interesting.
Yeah, I think when you go in, especially with blind tasting, where it's very deductive, when you have to get in there and like try to piece it apart and try to catch on things, I think your mind will catch on certain things and then it will run with it subconsciously. So I think when you get into saying, oh, what is a hop? Well, maybe you're latching onto a malt character, but then it goes you somewhere else, right? Like I love using Northern Brewer because of a woodsiness, but you would never have said, oh, this woodsy character, that's definitely Northern Brewer, right? Like, unless you know that going in. So it's kind of goes back and forth, and it's chicken or the egg when you describe it. But I mean, this makes sense. I mean, the fact that you're 10 versus 8 on the fruity means that some people were getting something earthy and some people are getting fruity, and I think that's a good balance.
Yeah, me too. It makes sense. And I think when you're going into a dark roasty beer, you're not expecting the fruitiness at least to come from hops. So I think your mind kind of, exactly. You're kind of biased to say either earthy or, maybe spicy or something like that. Exactly. So this makes sense to me. Now, again, no surprise, the number one malt characteristic that people noted was roast, with 10 out of 22 of the tasters noting that as being the most prominent. 5 people identified toasty as being the most prominent, and then 2 each said nutty, caramel sweet, and chocolate, and with only 1 person saying cracker bread crust. That spread, again, makes perfect sense to me.
Yeah. You added roast malt in a large quantity. You get roast character. This makes perfect sense. I like the toasty aspect. I'm guessing that's the Munich. But I think those are all just what people are going to find, to their own subjective palate. So
yeah, and it was a pretty common, not to me the malt bill wasn't crazy. I mean, so you kind of know what to expect from a stout malt bill like that. Now, in terms of yeast character, the most prominent that the 12 out of 22 people identified was esters. That's interesting to me because I don't know what they're identifying as esters, and to me it would be easy enough to go, okay, I know esters are fruity, I know hops are fruity. How do I know where this fruity came from. We kind of have an idea as experienced brewers and drinkers of the difference in that fruity characteristic. But I do think it's interesting that a majority of people, 12 out of 22, identified esters as being the most prominent fermentation characteristic.
Yeah, this is something I struggle with myself, even judging beers at BJCP at competitions, is that unless I can say with some certainty, some confidence interval that this is coming from a hop, I just say yeast esters, because yeast can make everything. Yeast can make so many flavors that don't exist in nature otherwise, right? So it's tough. And I try to in the aroma section, I try to tease it apart between the two, but it's honestly it is guesswork, and it's just how I'm interpreting the beer in that moment. So I think it goes both ways.
Yep, I agree. 6 people out of the 22 said that it was clean. Clean fermentation characteristic was the most notable. 2 identified phenolic, 2 identified sulfur, and nobody said wild. Again, you're kind of going in blind, not really knowing what to expect. And so when you're digging into this, you're like, do I get a little sulfur component? That doesn't surprise me too much. But I, again, I do think that to me, I would have identified it as clean, but I also know how the beer was made, right?
Sure.
And to me, the fermentation character did not contribute much to the fruitiness that I was picking up, which was very Citra to me, though it was subtle. It was just very Citra. So now, when asked if they noticed any off flavors out of the 22 people, only one person said yes, and they noted acetaldehyde. I've had experience with acetaldehyde flavor standards. I did not pick up any raw pumpkin, green apple, fresh cut grass, anything like that in this beer, so I don't know where that came from, but I'll take the person's word for it. One of my favorite questions is asking a person to look at the BJCP description and then rank on a 0 to 5 scale, how close does this match that description at the very least. And we also let tasters rely on prior experience with the style of beer. Again, I don't think any of these people had ever had a tropical stout. Maybe they had. 7 out of the 22 people rated this beer as being a 5 out of 5 in terms of representation of the description that the BJCP provides. 7 people out of 22. Another 8 gave it a 4 out of 5, and 5 people rated it a 3 out of 5. I mean, those are pretty good ratings, if you ask me.
I mean, like I said earlier, you targeted a style that is rare. I think it's not unfair to say rare.
Yeah.
You are writing a recipe that you're experienced writing recipes. You're adding the essentially edits that you need to meet the style guidelines, and you did it, right? I think this makes perfect sense, especially when there is some bias, right? Someone just had a beer and then hey, read this description. Would you think it fits the description? I mean, there is a little bit of that.
There's gotta be,
There's a little bit of that, but I mean, it all jives to me, and that's awesome. It's good work in this case, right? I mean, you're getting a majority, right? You had 22 people, and you had 15 people say, "Yeah, this is right there."
Yeah, I mean, it was at 20 people rated it a 3 out of 5 or higher, which is pretty impressive. Yeah. I believe it was 20, and then only the other 2 rated it a 2 out of 5. Nobody gave it a 1 or a 0, so it was arguably fairly representative of the tropical stout style as written by the BJCP.
Sure.
Yeah. So
sure.
Now another question we ask, the final question, is how much do you like this beer? And that's completely subjective. We understand that, but just let us know what you think of this beer on a 0 out of 5 scale. 12 out of 22 of the tasters gave it a 5 out of 5. That is the best rating that we've ever had on the Short and Shoddy series, probably on any beer that we've ever brewed. And Paul and I were both in love with it as well. 12 out of 22 people, a majority gave it a 5 out of 5. Those are some good numbers.
I don't know who's back I should pat more. Should I pat the recipe creator or the brewer? I mean, hey, you're both contributed equally, I believe, to this recipe. So I'm gonna give you co-authorships into this one.
Yeah, thank you for that, Andy. And another 8 people. So now we're at 20 people. Another 8 people gave it a 4 out of 5. So you got 12 at 5 out of 5, 8 at 4 out of 5. One person gave it a 3 out of 5. Nobody rated it a 2 out of 5. One person just didn't like it very much and gave it a 1 out of 5. And then nobody rated it a 0. It's pretty impressive, if you ask me. You know, for a beer that I like the word you're using, that I edited the recipe on to make it fit what I thought it would fit for the style guidelines. It just had that nice fruitiness, which I believe came from the hops, that really clean fermentation, that roastiness, and it just all worked together beautifully.
Yeah. I mean, this is, to me, another kind of analogy is like take a classic music song and then put it into new instruments, right? We're constantly coming up with new instruments, but new music and new patterns and chord progressions and stuff, but there are still classic songs you're going to learn. If you're going to learn guitar, you're going to play whatever rock album or pop album. So when new tools come around like Lupamax, why not use them in classic styles? Just see what happens.
Yeah, and again, tweaking an approach to a recipe or the way that you're brewing based on what you've experienced in the past. That's the whole impetus for Short and Shoddy. It's not to make a bad beer. A lot of people thought that when I started this series, it was, what can I do, to border on screwing up? No, we're actually using methods that we don't think are going to screw up the beer. It's why we
exactly.
It's pressure transfers for kegging and all of that. We're not trying to ruin the beer. We want to make the best beer we can while cutting corners. So, well, I absolutely love this beer. This is one of those styles that I'm comfortable saying, if you have been interested in Tropical Stout, or even if this doesn't fit Tropical Stout in your mind, but you want something that tastes really good, that's refreshing, that's roasty, that's fruity, make this recipe. It was absolutely delicious. I can't say how closely it aligns with classic examples of Tropical Stout because I've still yet to have one, but I will be keeping my eyes peeled because I want to try it. I thought this was an absolutely excellent beer.
I think I'm going to be brewing this one soon. This looks a lot of fun. Short and Shoddy means, hey, I can do this in a few hours. I have a 120 volt system, so
yeah,
I shouldn't need too much time either.
No, well, and to me, I think a fascinating experiment would be to take this recipe and then ferment one with a lager yeast warm and one with a lager yeast maybe a little bit cooler or something, and see, because most of our lager yeast fermentation experiments have been on pale lager naturally, right?
Yeah, exactly. So going to dark beers, yeah.
Exactly. Does it have an impact when you're fermenting these darker ales? I don't know. I think it'd be really interesting. So, well, we've got a couple reader comments to get to. The first one comes from a person named Jimmy, who says, I've made this style a few times. I like the addition of piloncillo sugar to dry it out a little and fermenting with kveik to help with the fruity character. That's interesting. I've used imperial yeast kveiking and mid-bust kveiks in my beer. I don't know what that means. I think a berry-forward hop would go well with the dark fruits coming from the dark crystal malt.
Yeah, and as we were talking about this, as we're going through Lupamax, I believe I still have a few pounds of Mosaic Lupamax around. I know Mosaic can be a very divisive hop. Many hops these days can be divisive. Some people don't like Mosaic, but it'd be interesting, just a little bit of Mosaic, and Lupamax would be an interesting berry versus that. Personally, I don't have as much experience with kveik as my friends do, but I do generally have the impression that it's like like ale, but at 100 degrees Fahrenheit. So you're getting those esters, and that could be quite interesting too, to drive fruit flavor, especially if you know that the fruit flavors will come off more tropical than not. Like the other thing, just thinking out loud would be this Brettanomyces trois or these other type of fruitier yeasts or Brettanomyces. It's a primary fermenter, which would also kind of play up the English notes or English history of the beer too. So there's a lot of room to experiment in that regard.
Yeah, little Brett, that'd be interesting, actually. My only concern with using kveik yeast is that in my experience, it does tend to keep the beer pretty hazy after fermentation.
That's true.
And again, I want this beer. There's just something about a murky, dark beer that kind of grosses me out. So
agreed.
Yeah. So just be careful with that. But I've also had some kveik fermented beers that are crystal clear. So that we know that that's possible as well. Next comment comes from Eric Branchard, who says, I feel like every Tropical Stout recipe I've seen was written by someone who only read the overall description without reading the rest of the guidelines that say little to no hop flavor in multiple places. This is a stout substyle that has historically been brewed using lager yeasts at warm fermentation temperatures in the tropics. The quote fruitiness is really from esters and possibly some fusels caused by fermentation character. I've never picked up any real hop character from Dragon Stout. Eric, I just want to comment that I absolutely did read the overall description as well as everything else in the BJCP and still intentionally went with Citra or Lupamax because of the editing component of Short and Shoddy. That was my whole point. It wasn't that I was trying to go against it, but plus I fermented so many beers with lager yeast warm and not gotten fruity that I just wanted to make sure that there was some goosed up fruitiness in this beer.
Absolutely. I agree with your technique. This is I think you did the right way of doing it, or how I would approach it if I was in that thinking about this from whole cloth. I think the thing that we have to remember about lager yeasts is we only play with a couple strains. And even back then, cleanliness, yeast health. I mean, I think temperature ranges mattered a lot more for some of these. And with modern yeast, we're just finding that they can operate over such a different time scale and temperature scale that it's not mattering. And then you add the layer of blind tasting, right? not going in with any subjective or preconceived notions about what the beer should taste like. Oh, you fermented it so hot. I mean, the best example is Kvike, right? It's 100 Fahrenheit and people are saying this doesn't taste like anything else other than an ale, right?
Exactly.
So, I mean, we're learning and we're understanding things better. And it's just the technology is so much more advanced than it was 150 years ago.
Absolutely.
It's just different.
Yeah, absolutely. So a final comment comes from D. Shiat, who says, Citra in a stout. What is the world coming to?
Well, we can go call our friends up in the Pacific Northwest and talk about black IPA or Cascadian dark ale. Dark ale. But no, I mean, like we said, it's a tool to fulfill a purpose, and I think it met the moment, right? It clearly, you got the fruitiness the way you needed to, and it came off tropical. It's a win.
If it doesn't fit the guidelines, I don't care. It was a delicious beer. I think, I know that Tropical Stout is technically a traditional style. To me, it's somewhat novel. It's a lot of fun, and I think people should try brewing a recipe that's sort of like this. And if they don't want to use Citra Lupamax, then find something else. But this was an excellent beer. So, well, I think that about covers Tropical Stout. Andy, is there anything else you'd like to say before we wrap things up?
This was good. I like the idea, I like the concept. I would be down to do this one as well and just run it right back exactly because you guys loved it, and I think we have similar beer appreciation, beer styles we like. So I'm down.
Yep. And I'll tell you what, this is a style or a recipe that I will be brewing again, probably exactly as it was brewed. It was that good. So, well, please remember to subscribe to our podcast, The Brew Lab, so you're notified when new episodes drop. And don't forget, you can click the link in the description of this episode to read all about this short and shoddy Tropical Stout. The Brewlosophy podcast is made possible by the generous support of our sponsors as well as all of our rad listeners. We seriously could not do this without you. Cheers to everyone who has subscribed and left a review of our show. It makes a huge difference. If you haven't yet, please consider doing so. Head over to brewlosophy.com/support to view a list of ways you can easily help us to continue producing this podcast. If you want a reward for your support, visit patreon.com/brewlosophy. Thanks again for listening. We'll be back next week with another episode of the Brewlosophy podcast. Until then, think beer.
Start off the morning with some hot tea, lemon and honey cause it soothes my throat. Put some herb in the bowl, yeah, it's homegrown. Ain't gotta